Hi everyone, welcome to round 3 of the Asia Pacific Asian British Parliamentary Debating Championships 2015. My name is Rafiq. I'll be the chair for this round. Handling with me are Fatana and Arya. On opening government, we have NTUEDS. On opening opposition, we have UGM1. Closing government, we have IMU2. And closing opposition, we have SMU2. Before we start the round, I would like to go through each speaker, invite each speaker to introduce themselves and the preferred gender pronoun. Starting with Prime Minister Leon, he, Fanny, she, Leader of Opposition Alip, he, okay, and Romario, okay, closing government, Altar, he, Brian, closing off Harry Harren from E and Jordan. Okay, before we move on, can somebody please defend the house read out the motion form? On that motion, without further ado, I'd like to invite Prime Minister Leon to speak on the motion that stands
Mrs. and Madam Speakers, the Myanmar government, they are very corrupted and they abuse their human rights in their domestic very severely. And this is what we see from daily news. And in this situation, this is why there will be a lot of rebellious groups. People in Myanmar nation, they are deprived of their political power in order to engage with the government. They don't have any other platform to contact or to negotiate with the government. Like the people, because their Myanmar government, they are corrupted, and then they don't give their authoritarian government, and they didn't give any enough political parties right for the people to form a political party in that nation, and they also deprive the people's welfare in those countries. And in those situations, people they were deprived their way, they were deprived the platform to engage with the government. And when this situation, you are a civilian, you don't have choice but to form or to fight back with the government. And this is when the situation, they will have a lot of rebellious group. And people, they have to find a way in order to attract the government's attention. And they will have to fight, they have to form in a group. That's why the armed conflict comes in. They have to find a weapon in order to come back with the government. This is why there are so many armed conflicts happening in Myanmar. We think that in this situation, people, especially the most vulnerable stakeholder, the civilians, they are dying because those armed conflicts. People, they are bombed and they are attacked by the chemical weapons in those countries, and they are bleed to death in Myanmar, and because of those civil wars happening in those countries. We think that this is the moment to give some political power of the Myanmar government in order to exchange the peace for the civilians and for the people, as well as for the Myanmar government in the long term. So we think that this is time to give some political power to them in order to exchange for peace for in the future. And yes, closing.
So given that these people have ordered attacks on civilian targets with chemical weapons, we think they ought to be tried, right? Not put into power, right?
There are some people, they already committed the atrocity. They should go to prison, no doubt. But we want to prevent in the future, there are some rebellious groups, there are potential rebellious groups. Once they are formed in the future, they should be given political right before they actually go to commit those atrocities. And for those people, they already, because this is not all people, this is not all people in the rebellious group, they all kill people. There are some rebellious groups, there are different rebellious groups. although all of them have arms, but not all of them start to kill people. They just use their weapon to threat the peoples. We think that before they actually kill someone, they should grant it the right in order to have a political representation. And what do we mean by political representation? Which means that we will give them seats in parliamentary. So we will give them recognizations in the parliament. We will give them a right to form the political parties. And I'm going to explain to you why there will be some armed group, at least some armed group, that will accept this deal. And second, why after our mechanism, we will actually bring two benefits to the country. First, we will have more stabilized Myanmar government. And second, with the civilians in Myanmar, they will have a better life. They will have a peaceful, at least more peaceful life in the future, because there will be less armed conflict happen in that nation. And firstly, as I mentioned, the Myanmar government is so corrupted. And in this situation, people have to fight in order to gain the political powers. And after we give them the political right, the representation in the parliamentary, and the members of the armed group, they will have incentives in order to join the political parties in the parliamentary. Why? There are some extreme armed conflict. There are some extreme political armed group. They just want to fight back. They just want to kill the people. We think that in that case, for those extreme armed group, okay, because they just commit atrocity, so they should go to jail. That's for true. But for another armed conflict, they are more rational. They won't want to kill people. They just want to use the weapon to threaten the people. We think that they should have the right to represent their people. The people they join them in order to have some political power to the government. And please sit down. Because we think that why there will be some armed group that will want to join the political party, and they will have incentives. Because once you join the armed group, you basically sacrifice your life in order to fight against the government. Once you have the political powers and you will be granted as a political parties, you will have a platform in order to debate with the government, to convince the people in the nation, in order to have more people to support you, in order to overthrow the government. And you don't need to sacrifice your life. And it's true, there will be at least some extreme group that won't want to join that political party. And okay, if they don't want to join it, we think it's fine. We just let them go to the prison. But after they join the political party, they have to abandon their weapons. They have to abandon every weapon they have in order for the exchange of the peace agreement. We think that once their mindset of those armed conflict members, they don't need to sacrifice their life. They don't need to leave their child, their wife at home. We think that this will be highly incentive for them in order to join that political party. And what happens then? Firstly, there will be less civil wars in the nations, because less armed conflict means less civil wars, and which means that more civilians, they don't need to die in the armed conflicts. And second impact we will have is it will provide more stabilized Myanmar government. Once there are continuously armed civil wars happening in Myanmar, it will destroy the infrastructure. It will destroy the hospital, the schools, everything in that country. It will make the country hollow out. And in that situation, the government cannot govern the countries at all. But after there are less armed conflict, they have the platform to negotiate with the government. And we think that the government, they only need to build few armed conflicts group. And in this situation, they can have more resources in order to build the infrastructure in that nation. And less armed conflict, which means that there will be more and more resources for that country and for the Myanmar government to provide the infrastructure and also the welfare of the people. And we think that it will bring more sustainable future for the Myanmar government and also for the civilians. And we think that for those extreme armed groups, they don't deserve the right, they don't participate, it's fine. But we want to change those rational armed groups before they go to stuff so extreme. We want to give them political right. That's why we proudly propose this motion. Thank you.
Prime Minister, that speech and begin the debate on the negative bank. Ryan Khalid, leader of opposition.
Ladies and gentlemen, the stance of opening opposition is very clear. We think that using violence and rebellion tactics to gain political representation is a wrong method for us to affirm to ethnic minorities and societies of Myanmar. What you're going to do when you apply this proposal and you provide a peace deal, you provide a political representation in response to a peace deal, what's going to happen is going to affirm the methods of using rebellion and to use violence as a method to achieve goals of certain communities. And we say that actually prolongs the harm and prolongs the conflict between communities in Myanmar. So that's going to be the identity coming on from opening opposition. How we believe in status quo methods are working to achieving peace, to ensure that peace are made and people are not dying. But their proposal is going to worsen the problem, going to create a more prolonged conflict, and we argue that's bad. So before I go on to my positive material, I'm going to provide several analysis and I'm going to provide several rebuttals towards opening government, right? First of all, they argued that there are no other platforms in status quo for certain communities to go towards, for example, to gain political representatives. We think that this is wrong, particularly in status quo right now. There are already fair election that allows parties to be formed, to allow communities to form their parties. For example, it already happened in 2010, and even now in 2015, how Aung San Suu Kyi, Myanmar's government's direct opposition, is allowed to run for parliament, meaning that politics is fair in status quo right now. So when you talk about armed rebel groups, those individuals who do not participate in this fair election, we say that those individuals don't have the right, nor don't deserve the right to participate inside politics to begin with, right? Sit down. Secondly, they also argue how right now status quo a lot of people are dying, and we cannot contain the conflict that occurs because of these rebel groups. We don't think that's true. We say that military government has enough military power to ensure protection of certain groups and certain communities that are within the conflict area. But moreover, we are very open to ensure that there's international help, for example, from ICRC or NGOs, or for example, UN, for example, to control the scope of the violence. We agree that that's not happening right now, but that's not happening right now. But we think that there will be an incentive coming out from ICRC and NGOs and UN, for example, peacekeeping troops, to ensure that they will contain and go into Myanmar and contain the conflict to prevent further deaths of people. Right? Before I go into that, yes, even though there's an election, that doesn't mean that is fair, because that is not fair. That's why there were still the armed conflict in that country. Yeah, look, we agree that your concern is regards to the death of these individuals, regarding conflict. I'm going to show you in my arguments how we agree that's going to be worth off on your side. First of all, my first analysis, how we agree that this legitimizes rebellion and violence as method to achieve political representations. The reason why people rebel and use violence and risk their life is because they believe in the idea that they will bear fruit in the end. And more importantly, they also believe in the idea that it's the most effective way to bear fruit in comparison to the other methods that exist within status quo. As a state, to prevent further rebellions, one needs to ensure that this rational calculus is not affirmed. Though it's hard for you to obtain representation through legal and peaceful means, we need to show towards these individuals that it's harder and, more importantly, impossible for you to achieve those means once you use violence, once you take hostage of the society using violence anyway. What happens is, if you give this exchange, you affirm that it's effective for people and communities of ethnic minorities, for example, to utilize violence as a method to achieve what they want, which is political representation. And as a result, it's going to be harmful on two fronts. Sit down. First of all, it's harmful because we need to understand that Myanmar has multiple ethnic minorities that are equally oppressed by the ruling government. What happens is, this will not only be used by a single ethnic minority, but this method will also be used by other ethnic minorities which they believe are not equally represented, or not enough to be represented by the Myanmar government. And what's worse is, then it's up to these ethnic minorities and these ethnic enclaves, for example, to subjectively determine for themselves what is enough for them. And we say that this in itself is bad, because towards these ethnic minorities, it will never be enough subjectively. So therefore, even if they are given political representatives right now, they will demand more and use this violence as a means to achieve it. But secondly, with this the second harm that will rise from this is the fact that the current rebel groups that you're giving political concessions to will also utilize the same methods in the future when they want to obtain another issue. Why? Because we understand there will be permanent peace deals. Yes, right? But before this peace deal, the Myanmar government also argues and also creates the narrative that they don't want to issue any concessions at all. But in the end, if the proposal is run, they will have concessions. So what the rebels will do is, the rebels will be able to act on these proceedings of the Myanmar government backtracking their aggressive stance to not wanting to give more concessions and use the same method to take the Myanmar government hostage and actually utilize violence. So as a result, on the side of opening government, what's going to happen is there's going to be a lot more conflict, understanding a lot of more ethnic minorities, for example, and ethnic and class will use violence to ensure that they get what they want, which is subjective and unable for us to mediate. Yes.
So in your first analysis, you said that the fact is that the military junta have actually attacked and killed many of the oppressors, many of the opposition members, which is why it's actually self-defense for these rebel members to actually fight back. It's because of the president and the military has already set by the government.
We understand. We also want, for example, for Myanmar government to lower and tone down their military offense, unjustified military offense with ethnic minorities. We understand that, but what you need, the question of this debate is not about self-defense. The question of this debate is to ensure which proposal, so there is minimalization of violence in status quo, and your proposal does not do that, right? So let's go to my second analysis. Said that we feel that this creates a prolonged conflict due to the societal backlash and rejection towards the deal. What's necessary for everyone in this room to understand is that in any conflict, we can never assume that government's interests and societal interests are in line or in any way similar. What this concession necessarily does is backlashes the society's grievance and anger societies further. Gentlemen, on three analysis. Number one, society and status quo have deep hatred and sentiment towards these rebel groups, especially majority of society who falls victim to the violence of these rebel groups. They will now feel that they're discredited by the Myanmar government because they are not protected by the Myanmar government, and the people that kills their family, people that kills their own communities and their own children, for example, will be provided concession and will be given what they want without any harm, without any punishment in the end. But secondly, society feel that they're not represented in the decision-making process of this deal, understanding it is a big deal, and it's a deal that will be made without society's consent. But lastly, what you need to understand is that other communities whose seats in parliament are taken in an unjust manner because you allocate a certain quota for these rebel groups will feel that they are treated unjust. And as a result, even if there is peace deals between the Myanmar government and these rebel groups, there will be a retaliation coming from the majority of society towards the communities that these rebel groups are trying to protect, which is the ethnic minorities themselves. So what I argued in my speech is that this proposal will prolong the conflict, but society will backlash against those communities. And even if the Myanmar government does not attack these communities, society, the majority of society will, and we are very proud to prevent that.
And the opposition that speech, but you mind debate, speak over the allocated time. That said, but Deputy Prime Minister give us.
Ladies and gentlemen, in my speech, I'm going to give two rebuttal and two analysis. Now, first, to go with my rebuttal. The opposition side is saying that if our model will let other rebellious group to take a sense procedure to take Myanmar government as a hostage, and because we will kind of encourage other armed group as to doing the same method in order to exchange for the political power. But we already tell you that is not true. We are, because under our model, we are just providing their necessary evil in order to in exchange for a future peace. Our Prime Minister already explained how we're going to achieve that, because we are going to provide these rebellious arms some incentive to give out their weapons. And we think that it's more reasonable for a reasonable human being, a rebellious human being, to simply to give out the weapon and instead of to sacrifice their life to achieve the political goal. We think any reasonable man will choose our size model instead of to fight and to form more conflict and intact groups in order just to fight for ideology. So we think that in your opposition side, your case is that you're under your assumption you can only will not resolve the conflict because you're encouraged. You're not dealing with that school. On the other hand, you're just saying that we just let these armed conflicts to happen again and again and to kill more people instead of actually provide some political incentive to change their behavior, to change these terrorist behavior. So that's what is a different it's a very difference between our model and yours. And it's like, second, we already told you that there are different armed groups. And we talked about there are some armed groups, they just have arms to threat people and to have a posture and to keep their own safety. And there are some armed groups that definitely they kill people and they torture people. And we already agree that we'll put these groups into prison as well. But in our model, in the long run, our model will provide more and more on groups to start to thinking, maybe I don't have to go that extreme. I just give up my weapon and then I will have a political representative. And we think it's more reasonable for a human being to do so. Yeah. Okay, then go to my two analysis. As my Prime Minister already pointed out, that under our model, we will provide a more public discourse. And I'm going to give you how this kind of public discourse is going to happen. First, just look at the Myanmar people here. There are some people, they are against rebel groups because they think they are violent. They refuse to listen to their political opinion. But once we provide a political representation in the parliament, these armed groups, they drop out their arms. And some people, they are originally against these violent groups. They will start to listen exactly what they want to resort for, what they want to change for the government. And instead of have a stigmatization over this armed group. And we think that will further to encourage a more rational discussion under our model. And this kind of rational discussion won't happen in your model because under your model, your people will consider armed conflict as evil. And instead of thinking what they are resourceful, what's their opinion, what's their criticism for the government. So in our model, we are more able to provide these incentives and to incite a more rational discussion. As for people who support for this armed group, they will start to think, hey, now you can have a legal representation, so it's better for you to drop out the weapons, or things you can already convince me by your word. You don't need to arms. So in the long term, there will be less and less people who will think that arms will actually bring peace. They will think that discussion between government and rebellious groups will actually bring peace. Yeah, so that's my first analysis. And second is that we think that only under our model, people for and against armed rebellious groups can start discuss together because there will be a platform, just like what happened in Tunisia. There is a dialogue protest who won the Nobel Prize because they provide platform. They encourage all kinds of rebellious groups and government to discuss together. So that under our model, people will start have a discussion. And we think this kind of discussion will lead to a further social conditioning into the future generation. Why? Because under status quo, the Myanmar people only knows one way to form a government. They know I can only overthrow a government by conflict, by armed forces. But under our model, in the long run, people against rebellious groups start to know their points of view, and people for rebellious groups and also know their points of view, and there will be platform for discussion in the long run. So our future, Myanmar's future generation will know, oh, there's another way I can have an opinion exchange in the public, and instead of fighting each other with arms and weapons, and we think this can only achieve under our model that our future generation will accept this kind of social conditioning instead of the state to quo that people are so violent and minority people has no result but to fight against each other. So I would think our model is better with a better environment for the social conditioning. And our model for also, and my third analysis, after this kind of public discussions, we provide a more stable government because there are a lot of people from different ethnic groups. They can have their own legal representation in the government. And in that sense, our future generation was going to learn exactly how this kind of public discourse is going to happen. So in the long run, it will provide a more stable government to the people in state school, but also people in the large future generation. So we are very proudly to propose this motion. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Prime Minister. Thank you for that speech. Now, to the opening half, let's invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition, Romario.
It is so confusing in one sense that opening government claim that Myanmar government is seen as corrupt and traitor and not being trusted at all by these armed groups. Then why suddenly in their model there would suddenly be a trust being formed by these armed groups and accept and surrender their guns to the Myanmar government just because we offer them a seat inside parliament? This is the links of the logic that is not being explained and established by opening government, which should apply to their ideas and conceptions about Myanmar. Two, ladies and gentlemen, if the armed group is that kind and good as opening government say to you, first of all, they would not use effective methods and stop this, since Myanmar has offered a legitimate method in terms of elections and representative, but they still choose to fight over us and use coercive manner, which is our movement in the first place. And not to mention, the protection of civilians and society during the armed conflicts in opening opposition's idea will try to minimize and localize the damage and open conflict as to one specific areas and explained by my legal position but not being engaged and tackled by opening government who should not go with their proposals. In my speech, I'm going to talk about two things. One, how exactly when we offer parliamentary seats to these armed rebels would not create stability inside Myanmar. And two, I'm going to explain to you why it will harm Myanmar's shift and progress towards democracy by offering them a parliamentary seat or representation inside Myanmar. And gentlemen, sit down please. Go with the first issue with stability of Myanmar. Some opening governments claim that by offering a peace model, peace contract, for example, it would create a stability inside Myanmar. In order for this argument to work and can be accepted, such opening government need to explain why political representation can accommodate the interests of the armed rebels in the first place. This question is important, ladies and gentlemen, for Myanmar's peace deal to work, so they don't have the armed rebels don't have to resort to another rebellion and respect the deals that is being made between them and Myanmar's government later. We don't think it would be so, ladies and gentlemen, and would harm the stability of Myanmar. Why? Because of what? Because first of all, assuming their interest is to overthrow the government or the corrupt government of Myanmar, as they say, at best case scenario of opening government, they would use parliament like what they say. However, it would not work as effectively because for them working with a corrupt government is totally bad. That these armed rebels should never listen to any policy or to any laws that try to be passed by Myanmar's government inside the parliament that they are sitting in, ladies and gentlemen. After decision making that is being made inside the parliament where these armed would like to sit in the future would be ended in a deadlock, and there would no concession being made by the Myanmar government and the armed rebels, because inherently there is no sense of trust between these rebels and Myanmar government. It won't be a rational discussion or effective discussion that is being claimed by opening government. Thus, the armed rebels won't see the peace deal worth to defend anymore if this scenario at best case of the opening government would happen in the future. Sooner, the armed movement would create an armed attempt as an option, available option for them. Thus, it would not be sustainable as the peace and rebuild inside and development inside Myanmar in the first place. And second, we think it would inspire another disenfranchised movement or other opposing group to use an equally armed and offensive method to obtain seats inside parliament. Because, ladies and gentlemen, this group would witness directly that one, these armed rebels or armed attempts to kill civilians and to kill each other, it grants them a seat inside parliament without them having to work and having to undergo democratic process like election or public debate to continue society. or two, they would use attention-seeking method like what they say to kill people even more. Because right now they know our weaknesses and will take hostages of society even further to drag the Myanmar government to listen and grant us random automatic seats. It would not be sustainable for Myanmar and would stable. Let's compound that in status quo with gentlemen. Even in status quo, we continue to fight against this rebel as long as they are not surrender or not willing to negotiate with us. We give cause for groups that uses violence, that it would not work if we keep doing so. That killing Myanmar society is bad for them. That they manage to, we right now, as the Myanmar government right now, managed to narrow down the armed groups and prevent another armed movements to reappear inside Myanmar right now. They also say that rebellion is self-defense. Last time I checked, Myanmar tried to take down the attack due to international push, sanctions, etc. And Myanmar government has promised of aid to promise to create an fair election. But this rebellion movement has tried to keep on attacking the Myanmar civil society around that. That exactly our rebels thinks us as a traitor and evil and should not be trusted. It is not a self-defense. It is continuous and sustainable attack towards us. We should not brand them. This is the bit of Myanmar not happening in the proposal. I'll take voting.
So the fact is, even if they have elections, they are pseudo elections, and if a government has 80% of advantage, you have to question the legitimacy of the election.
We acknowledge, even at the worst scenario, that the election might not be 100% fair, but achieving that 100% percentage of legitimacy took a time. At least whether there's a significant progress when Myanmar acknowledge opposition to exist, not exalt outside regime, for example, and allow people to also choose inside Myanmar. That is a significant progress that these armed rebels should appreciate and no longer keeps on killing while achieving a utopic goal in the proposal. We should show them it is not working. Second issue, how exactly granting parliamentary political representation would harm Myanmar's shift and progress towards democracy. My little proposition explains it's unjustified to cut the member of seat in parliament and allocate to armed rebels. We're going to extend you in the further cases. It is also unjustified because Myanmar government sacrificed the seat from other opposition movement in Myanmar that choose to be peaceful and the one that creates change in Myanmar, like National Democratic Party or any liberal party that exists in Myanmar. I'm going to prove that it's going to be even harmful in the future, as the current opposition would lose the trust in democracy and lose the trust inside Myanmar's government. Before that, what are exactly Myanmar's progress in democracy? Return to election and acknowledge opposition in the first place. Myanmar would manage to gain most power as an opposition party on groups they were able to gain the trust. However, if Myanmar choose to give political representation in form of seats in parliament, it will backlash to democracy. Because right now, the opposition who are currently choose to undergo peaceful method will witness Myanmar government allows undemocratic movement a privilege. We give them a surface when they are being undemocratic. And Myanmar would face another opposing power, which is another conflict that would be rising by the current party or current movement that becomes opposition, but choose to go with the method of election or peaceful method, gentlemen. And exactly as this process would prolong and push democracy even away further from Myanmar in itself. That means the election that we're trying to establish, even though it's not perfect, but it would not going to be improved in the future because our opposition would not create any sustainable check and balances because they would try to push us down because we allow undemocratic method to exist and grant themselves in Myanmar. Who are the victim? The victim is Myanmar's administration and law enforcement will be effective, and even society would going to be great even harmful in the future. That's why we should not give them any privilege. We choose to fight against them. Let's go with opening opposition.
Any definitive opposition? Before we move on, back to Apologies for that. Now to start the back half of the debate, I'd like to invite member of government to give it. Yeah.
I'd like to start with a few rebuttals, focused primarily from side opposition, whereby they kept on harping and harping on about the fact that violence can never culminate into any good whatsoever, and that letting these violent groups get their way will only result in more and more violence. And what I'm going to tell you here today is that violence can actually be used to achieve goals for the better good. We're going to take a look at some of the most historic events that have happened that are highly analogous to this debate. They can literally be used and translated into this debate. Let's talk about racial segregation in America. Strikes were carried out, people were killed, demonstrations were held, but at the given time, it was looked at such an abominable thing. It was like, how dare black people think they can do this? How dare they think one day they'll be able to sit in the same bus as us, in the same university as us, and look where that all turned out. Right now, the President of America is a black person. Do you think any of that could have ever been achieved if somebody didn't revolt against the government that threw them, if somebody didn't revolt against their leaders, if nobody took a stance to question the ideologies that were being passed on, if nobody actually took a stance to air out their views and say, no, you know what, we're all equal here, we all need to be represented, and there's nothing wrong with feeling the way we feel. We say violence can be used. Sit down, I'm not done with my rebuttal. We say violence is a means and it's a justice to the end. We believe in cutting the arm to save the rest of the body. We can use violence, and it has been used in the past to make sure that societies continue to progress, to let the feelings that have been buried for centuries and centuries to finally come out so that greater issues can be dealt with. Second of all, what side opposition does not, side government does not seem to want to engage in is that they say this government, if they yield to these rebel groups, they'll have yielded to violence. Therefore, once the deal is made, they'll continue overstepping their boundaries and continue asking for more. Which is why I would like to shed light on the word permanent peace deals. These means entailing things such as disarming these people, justice being served, amnesty not being pardoned a second time, and thirdly, ensuring that there will be peace for days, years, and more decades to come. What you guys are trying to see, you guys are trying to create a paradigm whereby there will be complete anarchy, and that these people, once they get into power, they'll be having a stronghold over the government, and they will continue being violent, and they will continue being rebellious. What we're trying to say is that most of these rebellious groups have actually seriously been misunderstood. Some of them go by the name United Students Democratic Front. Can you imagine what type of horrible military rule they must have been under for them to revolt? These people are not just rebelling against the government, they're actually desperate. They've resorted to violence as a last means. Okay, it's not like they haven't tried other avenues and finally exhausted them. These are people who do not see any reason in no longer trying to talk with the government, and they have taken matters into their own hands, which is why we believe it's extremely important to immediately be able to give them political representation, because one, they already have great control over vast amounts of areas, which is why the government is going to be forced to look at such desperate measures, because desperate times call for desperate measures. These people are people who have been forced to turn to violence due to desperation, misunderstanding, minority groups that never get represented. And these minority groups are finally coming up and speaking out for themselves. And we are wondering why on side opposition, this cannot happen. Okay.
Rewarding that violence pushes these people away from utilizing peaceful and democratic elections as a means to forward their ideals, as opposed to simply using violence and the death of thousands of civilians. Are you willing to ensure that it's okay?
What we're saying on our side is it's going to be messy. We understand that. It has been messy. It will continue to be messy until these people get their want, which is political representation. We've already said that the government is completely unstable. They've carried out elections and they want to say they've won by 80%, yet the entire majority of the people are against them. What does that mean? They're not being extremely transparent, they're not being complacent. There's no transparency between what's actually happening within the parliament and what the people are actually saying. We're saying that these people are already in power. Their influence is so big, they control vast regions. They're ready. The only thing that hasn't happened for them, sit down please, the only thing that they need right now is to actually be given a place and a podium to actually be able to air out their views. We're saying that these people already have such a strong influence over all these areas, and the only thing that separates them from actually being able to represent is the fact that they have to take a violent stance more rather than a diplomatic stance due to the fact that the government is oppressing them, and they only see violence as being the only way for them to revolt against them. These people are not willing to back down, and we believe they should not back down, because them backing down means yielding to the government, which at the end of the day will not result into greater political representation, which on your side you said will take care of the problem, but we do not believe. These bad feelings will still be buried. They will still ensure that there will be more tensions, and these tensions will continue exacerbating until the issue is actually dealt with. I'll take you.
Are you willing to say to society that violence is an effective means for you to obtain your deal? Are you willing to say to society that it's okay to be like undemocratic manner, society to walk society and what progress to use democracy?
This is exactly what I told you at the beginning of my debate. I told you that violence can be used to achieve the goal. That's what has been happening for centuries. That's why there's so many wars in history. This is the history we've been learning over and over again. Albert Einstein said insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. What you try to tell me here, the practical implication of what side government is actually trying to say here is, let this government continue being in power until one day, we don't know which day that is, but we'll just assume one day power will be restored. We're saying no power won't be restored. We're saying we take matters into our own hands until people actually start looking at us and start viewing us as people who need to be represented, so that one day when when the Myanmar people finally get the democratic representation, they do not feel the need to resort to violence means. These are not people who decided to take violence means. These are people who are pushed to take these violent means. I am sure what they're fighting for is equal political representation. That is why you see many different armed rebel groups. That is why you don't just see 1, 2, 3, or 4. This is why you see hundreds of them. This means that there is a great disproportionate amount of non-transparency within the government, and these people are actually brave enough to stand up and say something about it. There is a reason why amnesty is granted to some people, because they believe in the greater good, and they believe that some people need to be pardoned in order for the country to move on. And the political leaders should also face exile and should also be tried, because they are not also off the hook. What side government here tries to tell, side opposition tries to say here today, is that the government is always right. Their failed nation, their failed state. That is why people like Robert Mugabe, even though at the beginning they were able to take their country's independence, they are now being tried at ICC for being what? Dictators. They are now actually facing exile. We say, one, violence can be used as a means, as a justice to the end, and two, a permanent peace ensures permanent peace for the country, which is our end result at the end of the day. With that, we're very proud to.
Government to that speech. Now to hear from people in the opposition, I provide Hari, the member of opposition.
Mr. Speaker, before delving into anything else, we believe that certain fundamental characterization has been done in this debate. We think that hasn't been done in this debate, and it's hugely important that we do it right now. Firstly, we like to characterize Burma and Myanmar and talk about it, right? We think that generally, side government has been dealing with a version of Myanmar that was like, it's fairly outdated, right? They're dealing with a winter version of it that was like apparent like maybe like 3 years ago or something. We think that that's not really relevant anymore. We think that Burma is taking very decisive steps towards becoming more democratic. They're much more okay with the idea of democracy. In fact, they're embracing it, right? We think that they've completely ignored that, and they've continued to look upon Burma as an authoritarian system that is not looking to embrace democracy and its ideals, right? And we will bring to you now substantive that we believe that allowing this to happen, allowing side props around their policy, would mean that you principally cannot uphold democracy, and also mechanically democracy will fail, right? So moving on, we think that secondly, we have to talk about the current armed rebel leaders, right? And we have to characterize these people because this didn't come up in the debate at all until now. We think that unlike what like member of government would have you believe, right? These armed leaders aren't like heroic freedom fighters in general, right? That's not really like who they are. We think that they are leaders. They're essentially heads of criminal empires. Basically, they control like huge drug cartels and huge opium cartels as well. We think that you know, generally they're also like they're also assholes. Like they have their own like huge human rights issue problems. We think that they generally have like a huge amount of barbarous acts and atrocities that are counted to them as well. We don't think that they're fair representatives of the minorities that they claim to represent, and neither are they particularly peaceful representatives of these democracies that they claim to represent, right? So that brings us to our rebuttal. So the idea that there is a legitimacy of minorities in these side propositions paradigm, right? Where if you allow these people in, like suddenly people will look upon minorities as legitimate, and one day we'll have like the equivalent of like the US where like black people will be treated bad and stuff, right? These minorities. We think that won't happen simply because the populace won't respect these minorities, because they know that these minorities, the leaders who have been appointed to represent these minorities, are barbarians and have committed like major atrocities against the majorities in Burma, right? For no reason, they will not have the legitimacy. They won't have the legitimacy of in the face of the people, right? Which means that they won't be taken as democratic representatives of the people and the minorities that they will claim to represent. Which means that in effect, in a democracy, these minorities won't have the kind of legitimacy that member of government wants them to have, right? So we think that that's not going to be, that's not going to happen under their paradigm, right? This means that what will happen instead is that these minorities will be treated with contempt because the very militant, antagonistic terrorist faces, the very militant, antagonistic terrorist faces that have been villainized and perpetuated within the Burmese majority will now be sitting in parliament representing the minorities, right? This means that the minorities will be treated with a level of contempt by the populace and will not be allowed to have any form of legitimacy, right? So we think that idea that this somehow allows for legitimacy of minorities is not going to happen, right? Secondly,
on that.
no. Yeah, okay. Yeah,
what about somebody like Nelson Mandela, who's actually a criminal who's gone to war, but you hear that
okay, no, this is very important. Like, yeah, sure. Well, we have to talk about why Nelson Mandela went to jail. Nelson Mandela sure was like a criminal in the sense that he went to jail, right? He didn't commit human rights atrocities like these Burmese people have. We think that fundamentally like makes these people barbarous monsters, and Nelson Mandela not, right? So we think that analogy is usually kind of it doesn't apply at all. No, I just took one. So like moving into my substantives and why this principally doesn't uphold the idea of democracy, right? Aside from just being principally unjust, which is in the sense that we are allowing criminals to essentially have legitimacy and power in our system, which does not at all follow like judicial process of trying criminals for their crimes, right? We also argue that this is principally threatening the idea of democracy that Myanmar plans to take. Myanmar wants to take a general view of democracy, right? We think that this is because the power that these people have achieved is not achieved through the consent of the government, right? That means that it's not achieved through the consent of the minorities that they claim to represent. These people are barbarous assholes, right? And basically they got to power by power mongering and war mongering, right? We think that they don't accurately represent the minorities that they claim to represent, and we think that if these people were to come to power, then they will be able to force the minorities' votes through their entrenched power already. That means that they will not accurately represent the minorities that they claim to represent in parliament, right? So we think that they won't be able to fulfill that. Yeah, quickly.
The Myanmar government is not as wonderful as you depict. And you didn't fail to prove that why there will be incentive for the armed
okay, sure, yeah, okay.
The
reason why there will be incentive, like we think that the reason why there will be incentive for the Myanmar government to allow like legitimate non-criminal people to ethnically to represent these ethnic minorities because they are taking a slant towards democracy and they will want to protect that slant on an international level as well as on a local level, right? It's a genuine slant that they are taking, and naturally they want to see it logically progress, right? We don't see that is a huge problem. So moving on, aside from their power not being through the consent of the government and therefore their power being entrenched and they are saying in parliament not representing the minorities that they claim to represent, it also sets a precedent of legitimization for power, gaining power through force in a nascent democracy, right? This basically means that you say that on a principle level, it's okay to award people power if they are violent enough or if they are strong-handed enough in a democracy, right, which has the entire idea of power through peace and power through equal representation. So we think that that threatens the idea of peace in Burma as well. Fundamentally, also, we allow when you allow antagonistic terrorists into a legitimate government, then these people don't really focus on running a legitimate government, right? They will focus on running their own personal interests and their own self-serving interests because they're also heads of criminal empires. So moving on to the idea, of political legitimacy of criminal dons and mafias and why there's a huge problem in Burma, right? We think that in Myanmar generally, right now, there's the country is rife with crime, right? And such a situation where there is that kind of rife criminality inherent in that society makes it inherently vulnerable to like democracy, right? Or rather, inherently antagonistic to democracy, right? We think that democracy can't survive where the authority of the government is constantly being threatened by criminal elements within the government, right? We think that what this does is that it legitimizes state criminal elements and it allows them to perpetuate their crime with the legitimacy of parliament behind them. It means that they can now run their huge opium businesses with the added legitimacy of being a politician, a legitimate politician in their country, right? We think that this completely ignores the reason why these people are criminals in the first place, which is that they have taken part in very legitimate criminal acts and have very legitimate criminal empires that will be sustained if they are allowed to come into power without repercussion, right? So we think that that's a huge problem. We think that it threatens the kind of peaceful environment that you need for a nascent democracy to formulate and engender itself, right? We think that that threatens democracy in Burma because Burma is a very fragile new democracy. It's trying to move towards democracy, and right now it won't be able to do that, right? And moving on to the final idea, the idea of democratic signals. We think that Burma is hugely unique in that it's a new nascent fragile democracy that is trying to take democratic steps. We think that if Burma succeeds in this without letting these people come in and corrupt and hijack that system, then what it will do is it will set a global precedent for democracy as well, right? And for democracy taking root. So we think that for all these reasons, we're very, very proud to oppose.
The member of opposition, that speech now to conclude the government bench. I'd like to invite Brian, the government whip.
All right, these are a few rebuttals from the opposing government, ladies and gentlemen. They come up with the idea that Burma is actually moving towards a democratic country. Ladies and gentlemen, that is true, but they don't explain why they are moving towards a more democratic country, ladies and gentlemen. The idea that they are given here is that Myanmar has actually been a peaceful country and the junta came in by choice of the people. Ladies and gentlemen, let me give you a history of junta, right, ladies and gentlemen. One day, my uncle actually turned on the radio and he said, they are nationalizing the whole country. Everything you own now belongs to the country. And he had to flee the country, ladies and gentlemen. The junta came in by force, and they were criminals and they were evil, ladies and gentlemen. As the government has often shown, they are actually corrupt. They are corrupt, ladies and gentlemen. The government, right, the opposition is painting this idea that it is the rebels who own all the black market goods and opium deals. Ladies and gentlemen, why would a military junta who needs money, who came in illegally, would not resort to the exact same thing, ladies and gentlemen? The fact is, a lot of the opium fields are actually being run by the junta themselves, ladies and gentlemen. So the idea that the whole new idea that if you allow the rebels to come in, criminals are now coming into power is completely ridiculous, because in current status quo, the criminals are already running the government, ladies and gentlemen. However, so I believe that this whole idea that the closing government has come in is actually ridiculous. And so they sit down. And the idea that why they are becoming democratic was because of international pressure by the US to actually allow Aung San Suu Kyi to actually become released from house arrest and to allow opposition, ladies and gentlemen. They were threatened with lots of sanctions. They were threatened with war, and they were teased with international peace deals, ladies and gentlemen. The reason why they allowed all this fake elections here was actually to allow foreign businesses to actually come in, which is why Myanmar has become such a huge hotbed and has developed, ladies and gentlemen, into a rising economy, ladies and gentlemen. So this shows that the government has to change, ladies and gentlemen. And as the opening government has actually said, that they have actually taken one step in allowing a fake elections, ladies and gentlemen. But the point is, as we have said in the government, is that why stop there? We need to take another step, ladies and gentlemen. We need to allow these rebel groups who have been entrenched in this area, in certain areas for since the 70s, ladies and gentlemen, who have actually formed really strong connections and community within the country, ladies and gentlemen, because the fact is Myanmar is not the strength that it was, as they have already said. They have actually had to move back to a more democratic country because sorry, just give me a second, right? I'll take you in a bit. They have moved to a more democratic country because they are weaker, ladies and gentlemen, and these rebellious groups have actually entrenched themselves stronger in these areas, ladies and gentlemen. So if you actually continue fighting them, ladies and gentlemen, we actually have to wonder what will happen if the population themselves start to change their opinions and will actually go against the government. We actually create a new civil war, ladies and gentlemen. This is why our side here has actually allowed a stronger discourse, ladies and gentlemen. We have actually tried to come up with the idea that if we allow this discourse and acceptance into them, we will actually lead to a greater society. And that is why it is important for these rebellious groups to be forgiven and given amnesty, for us, for Myanmar to be able to progress forward, ladies and gentlemen, or else we're just going to be stuck there. And this whole side, just one minute, the whole side of the opposition here is okay with us, with the Myanmar government sending more and more troops to kill more of these rebellious soldiers and to allow killing, ladies and gentlemen. The fact is, all their statements today have been on the assumption that the rebellious groups will continue to fight when their feet are stepped on, ladies and gentlemen. But as my second speaker, as the member of government has actually said that this permanent deal means that we are actually stopping fighting now. We are actually saving lives now. Instead of where we're talking about hypotheticals and what ifs, we are actually saying that we are actively stopping what is the killing that is going on right now. Something that the opposition has not been able to actually implement and actually explain to us why that's bad. All right, I'll take you.
You don't like the government because they express society, but at the same time you allow violence and make your concessions as a method to achieve your needs as opposed to utilizing fair elections that is now existing.
All right, I agree. The fact is that junta itself started the whole idea of military force to actually destroy the destroy the opposition, ladies and gentlemen, and that is why the rebels fought back. The reason why we have used this outdated machinery that the opposition has started was because of this. Was the idea that the rebels were took up arms by itself. But ladies and gentlemen, right now in the current situation, you actually see that the opposition, the fact that the government is actually weaker and actually more willing to listen to its residents, that we can actually see that the rebels, that the opposition was given free rein and that elections was allowed. Ladies and gentlemen, we think that's a logical next step for us to legitimize the rebels who are violent, ladies and gentlemen, because these people are now the new opposition members, and these are the people who have large influence in areas, who have been able to protect these areas for long periods of time, and are the main people who are actually in charge of these areas where the rebels are actually present, ladies and gentlemen. Something the government has not been able to do for the past few years, ladies and gentlemen. All right. And then I'd like to talk about a little bit about what the opening government has said about how we are legitimizing violence and about how we are legitimizing violence. Ladies and gentlemen, the thing is, as I've already said, the government started the government shot first. Let's use the Star Wars reference, right? So the rebels were actually forced to do this, and were actually forced to show their hand and to fight back, ladies and gentlemen. So we believe that the idea that violence was started by the rebels is actually not fair. It was actually started by unjust and a government who actually put themselves in power by force, ladies and gentlemen. So we believe that's unfair. So I'd like to just tell you about our worst case and best case scenario, and their worst case and best case scenario, right? Our worst case scenario is that after a long period of peace, ladies and gentlemen, the war actually starts back, and all those lives that were that war actually starts back, ladies and gentlemen, and we actually concede to that, but we believe that this is a necessary step to allow democracy to occur. Our best case scenario is that we actually managed to create peace in Myanmar, a country that's been in war for the past 50 years, ladies and gentlemen. Their best case scenario, ladies and gentlemen, is that for the next 20 or 30 years, while we wait for all the seniors in the government, on the junta government to die, all the rebels will continue dying, and all the soldiers are sacrificed. Their worst case scenario is that the civil war re-erupts and people continue dying and nothing is solved in Myanmar. So with that, I beg to propose. Thank you.
I will choose the opposition as well as the debate. Let's divide the opposition group.
Mr. Speaker, I put it to you that the government would sacrifice democracy on the altar of an artificial peace. So there's three clashes in today's debate. First, the idea of justice and rights. The second, the legitimacy of democracy under their policy and under ours, so comparative. And the last, the long-term democratic sustainability of Myanmar as compared under both paradigms. So first of all, on the idea of justice. Now, I'm not quite sure what they were saying on their side of the house, but what it seemed like, Mr. Speaker, was they would take these rebels, bring them into parliament, and give them pardons, right? It doesn't look like they were in any way punished for the kind of gratuitous human rights violations that have clearly been committed by them. We think that when human life is taken, we think that when atrocities are committed against another human being, that justice has to be served. We don't think that this violence is ever legitimate, right, Mr. Speaker? We don't think that it's ever justified for one man to raise his hand like in hatred against another, right? We think that, the example that was brought up, like on-site opposing government about Nelson Mandela and about US civil rights. We think that if the colored people of the Americas had resorted to violence, then they'd be in a far worse position than they are today, right? We think that civil discourse, we think that democracy is the way to sustainable and balanced representation in government. We think that that's the way to gain access to rights for these specific minorities, and by doing so, we're going to eliminate the genesis of conflict, right? So, Mr. Speaker, first things first, right? The idea of legitimacy of democracy. Both of you sit down. So here's the thing, Mr. Speaker. We've got a problem here, right? On their side of the house, they said, look, we think that if we bring in these people, they are criminals. They actually just consider that in their wit. So here's the thing. This junta, these people in the junta, the current government of Myanmar, are criminals themselves. They are the ones that came into power through force, right? And that's the kind of paradigm that we're trying to change, right? When you give these people political power in exchange for holding the nation's head to the barrel of a gun, we think that that's inherently problematic because of two issues, right? First of all, the idea of democratic representation. Now, we don't think that the government has the ability to devolve powers that were not even given to them legitimately in the first place to a party that's even less legitimate than them, right? In terms of representation, in terms of democracy, we don't think that you're allowed to give away the right to rule, especially when these people never consented to that right to rule in the first place under a free election, Mr. Speaker. We think they're essentially problematic. I'll take you in a moment, man. We think that it's essentially problematic because these claims are essentially arbitrary, right? Because we think that it undermines democracy at the point where power is attained, power grows from the barrel of a gun, right? Yes.
Who holds the government accountable for the crimes that they have committed? Why should only the rebel group be subjected to
Sure.
justice and not
Largely that's outside the debate, but let's deal with that, right? So we think that at the point where we have democratic elections, we'll just try everybody, right? We think that the fact that the government has committed crimes doesn't give you carte blanche for you to allow these rebels to engage in the same sort of indulgent and immoral behavior, right? We think that that's essentially conceding a point to us, right? These people ought to be tried rather than being put into parliament, right? We think that eventually, as the political power of the junta is eroded, as elections carry on, that's necessarily going to change. We think that's necessarily good in the long term for democratic Burma, right? So on the idea of why these rebel groups actually do these things, the idea of the genesis of conflict, right? Now, the reason why these rebel groups are actually in the fight, the reason why they've taken up arms against the government is because of simple things, right? Discrimination, access to rights. And we think that the best way to give them these rights, the best way to address the genesis of this conflict is democracy, right? We think that when these people have fair representation, we think that when these people are allowed to elect representatives into the government to represent them and to champion their rights, we think that that's the best way to achieve this sort. We think that that's the best way to achieve rights, to achieve equality for these people, right? And I've got quite a few tiers of analysis here as to why specifically government and democratic stability is going to suffer under that paradigm. So, first layer of analysis, right? The idea of a fractured parliament, right? Nobody is going to give legitimacy when you have a terrorist sitting in the opposition seat in parliament. Nobody is going to respect him because he has no mandate, he has no people to represent. He's not accountable to anybody. The reason why he's there was because he was able to scare the government badly enough with the threat of bloodshed, right? We don't think that's any kind of mandate. We think that's absolutely antithetical to democracy at the point where this person is ethnically based, to the point where his backing is derived largely along ethnic lines. We think that's especially problematic because he introduces sectarianism into politics, and that's exactly what we don't want on our side of the house, right? We think that this representation should evolve organically because politicians want to get the votes. They want to get the plurality from these particular minorities. We think that's the best way to get representation, the best way to get rights and access to services for these people, right? At the point where the people in parliament representing them are terrorists, at the point where they act in ethnic interests or in personal interests. Perhaps they might even buy into the corruption of the junta. No, sit down. Perhaps they might even buy into the corruption of the junta, right? And they become the same sort of corrupt military, like that kind of like dictator that we've seen in power in the first place, right? So now we're going to talk about vote splitting. When the minorities have these particular people in power, the public perception of these minorities, as represented by bloody-handed terrorists, is necessarily going to suffer because they have artificially become the figureheads of these ethnic minorities, and it's going to be necessarily very easy to demonize because of things like war crimes, right, Mr. Speaker? So we think that that's inherently problematic as well. They're not going to be able to get those rights, right? And then on the idea of vote splitting, right? We think that's also problematic insofar as these people are going to be crowding out like legitimate representatives, moderate politicians who are willing to take up the cause of these minorities, minority politicians who are willing to engage on their ethnic platform. So on another level, right, on the last one, right, like we think that's problematic insofar as these people have no claim to actually represent the people that they do. Because not every ethnic minority in Burma is a crazed terrorist, Mr. Speaker. At the point where these people claim to represent interests, they are purely their own, they are not endorsed by the people that they claim to represent. These people are always going to be looked upon with derision, with scorn, as terrorists, radicals, and freaks, right? And we think that that is the worst possible outcome for the future of Burma. We think that it's undemocratic, unsustainable, and unethical, and for all these reasons, we take today's debate.
Thank all the teams, speakers, we're outside. If you have a decision, we'll call you back. Good job, though. Nice,